zoom over to, if that's the right word, is our our Canvas website. So let me put it on student view. Hopefully, can you still see it? Right. Now, what you may or may not have noticed is that there's a second topic here, or a second, what's that called? Module here, right? So the main module is the one here. And if you don't know where all our lectures are, you click on that. And then if you wanted week 3's lecture, you click on that. And if you want to see it, there's Fridays, for instance, right? So if you don't know where our lectures are, that's where they are. And there's some other interesting pages, but the one I'm going to deal with is this one. Here is a glossary of statistical terms. Don't worry about that until you need to. There's a how to use your TI-84. So I just got a PDF of the whole manual, because you know, if you've got a TI-84, the book that came with it is probably long lost by now. So there's the PDF version of it. And the ones that we're going to look at here is, first thing I'm going to use talk over this one, and then I'm going to go and do this one. So click on this one. It's a PDF. If you want to make it a little bit bigger, you can hit that button. And here is some stuff. It gives you a little bit of more detail on sampling bias, right? How you can collect data in a way that may not reflect the typical person from that population. So here's a new term that I haven't mentioned, but it will appear from time to time. It's called the sampling frame. So imagine that you're interested in the political views of people who live in Bremerton, and you decide that you're going to collect a sample of 200 people. Now, what you want is that those 200 people are a fair representation of all the political views in Bremerton. But you decide that the way you're going to find these people to ask them is with a telephone survey. And essentially what happens is you get 100 people's telephone numbers and you phone them. Right. Now, the sampling frame here represents the people that you could get in your sample. So in this case, the only people you're ever going to be able to talk to were people whose telephone numbers you know. Now, that isn't the same as everybody in Bremerton that you could have spoken to. Isn't there a subgroup of people who you would never get on that sample? So the sampling frame is people who have a telephone, right? That you can get a number for. So what kind of people would you miss in a story like the one I've just did? So the sampling frame is people who have telephones of which I know the number. Who do you miss? Who do you not get to talk to?
The general community.
A bit vague about that. Any more detail on that?
Well, if you're asking only the people that you know, then, well, one could assume that you surround yourself with people who have similar ideas or thoughts as you.
Right, so it would be a good idea to phone a friend. Gotcha, that would be bad, that's right. Suppose that, and you can do this, you know, you can get companies that will give you the telephone numbers of people because you want to sell them stuff, right? So suppose it was people that I didn't know, but still had telephones. But what you said is correct. I shouldn't ask people I know because they're probably going to have similar views to me. So any others before I hit you with this one? I want you to think about it. Let me just say it. People have telephone numbers that I know the number of. That's who I'm going to ask in my sampling frame. But who am I missing?
The people who you don't have their number for?
Correct. Aren't some people, and we call it in Britain X directory. Is that what you call it in America? You can have a phone number that is an X number. In other words, nobody knows it, right? You can't get auto dialing for it, right? A private number, would that maybe be a term you might use, right? Them. And aren't you not going to be able to talk to anybody that doesn't have a phone? That one is more serious to me. So I'm going to make some assumptions, which are probably going to be slightly wrong, but I think in general are true. Would you agree if you don't have a phone, you're probably poor? That's one of the reasons you don't have a phone. Now, there could be others. I hate technology. I don't want a phone, right? Yeah. But in general, would you agree there's probably a lot of poor people who don't have a phone? Or extremely poor even. In a place like America, you probably have to be extremely poor, right? Not to at least have a phone. Would you think that extremely poor people might vote differently than others? Yeah, so I think that would be a causal bias. So the sampling frame is the people that you could use in your sample. And the problem is that you might not reach some of the people because of that. We've talked about these ones here, but this is another place where you can read about possible biases, right? So here's some examples of bias in the question. So suppose I'm interested in people's opinion of abortion, right? Are you in favor of it? Are you against it, right? So if I was trying to ask the question in an unbiased way, I would try and keep it clean and simple, right? Are you in favor of abortion? Yes or no, right? Give them a choice. If you were going to introduce bias into that, and almost always it's done deliberately, right? That people know they're doing it. You would ask the question in two different ways. And the way that you ask the question will change the response. I'll give you an example. And I'm not trying to offend anyone here, but just to do it, right? I could ask you, are you in favor of killing an unborn child? Would you agree that is a biased way of asking, are you in favor of abortion, right? I could have asked you, do you think it's a woman's right to choose whether or not she should have an abortion? Can you see that both those are asking about abortion, but isn't one more pro and one more anti? You see, that's bias in the question, right? You can do everything else perfectly correct, but if you screw up the question, aren't you going to corrupt the data? Now, why do they do it that way? Don't politicians want people to be in favor of their ideas? So when they do polls, don't be surprised when they ask people the question, it will be phrased in a way that will encourage people to say yes or no, if that's what they're after, right? And then they go on TV and say, 82% of Americans are in favor of my idea. Well, they were the way you phrased it, but if the other party decide to phrase it a different way, only 20% of America would be in favor of it. Can you see that? I'm exaggerating, but can you see how that can work? So be very skeptical about any politician telling you that they've got data to prove that X% of Americans like my idea. They've done, they've done examples of this just to prove a point, right? And I can't remember the numbers, but you can look online for examples of this. 60% or more of Americans are in favor of getting free stuff. And 40% of Americans are not in favor of paying for someone else to get free stuff. Do you see that it depends on what you ask them, what the answer is, right? So you can use one of them and say, well, we don't want people to get this free stuff, right? Because we don't want to pay for it. And then you could say, well, we want this free stuff, right? By the way, there's no such thing as free stuff. Yeah, just put that out there. There is no such thing as free stuff. Somebody somewhere pays for it, right? And you might not be paying for it, but somebody else is, right? Or you will be paying for it later on when you've got a job and they tax 40% of your money, right? So nothing is free in this world. So don't believe a politician when they tell you it is free. And since it's in my brain, I'll get this out. I remember there was talk about free community college education. And a lot of you would probably think, yeah, I like that. When I heard it, my brain went and said, who's going to pay me? Evidently it's free, right? So it can't be costing anything. You see what I'm getting at? Nothing is free. Especially when a politician tells you. Sometimes you put an unintentional bias on the question, right? It's not a deliberate, you want to do it, it just happens. And that can certainly cause problems. And they give you an example here. We've talked about people like to be liked. So sometimes people will lie to you because they don't want you to think badly of them. And that's desire of respondents to please. Oh, that's a really good one. Asking the uninformed. I'm not quite sure if this is correct. Well, it is correct, but I don't think it's nice to say. People do not like to admit that they don't know what you're talking about, right? They don't do dumb. So if you went and said to them, what's your opinion of Initiative 77? Instead of saying, I've never heard of Initiative 77, won't they just make up something? Yeah, it's a great idea. I'm in favor of it. That's an example of asking the uninformed, right? Now, if you know that most people don't, I made that number up, by the way, most people don't know what Initiative 77 is, it is okay to say to them, Initiative 77 is, and then do, you know, whatever Initiative 77 says it's wanting to do. And then you can ask them, are you in favor of it? At least now they're informed, right? Does that make sense? If you just ask people and they don't know the answers, they don't very often say, I don't know. They're more likely to just make up a yes or a no based on whether it sounds good. Yeah, don't do one of those questions that English people do. You know, those ones that have got triple negatives. Are you in favor of repealing the banning of handguns? Now, are you in favor of repealing something? Does that mean you want them to repeal it, or you're in favor of them staying? Or are you in favor of them not repealing it and against the thing staying? You see what I mean? You could read that question, you think, I'm not sure what I'm saying yes to now, right? You know, those kind of negative inside another negative kind of thing, or a double, whatever you may call it. You know the thing in English, I think it's called a double negative, right? Are you in favor of not doing homework? Isabella? What's your answer? Are you in favor of not doing homework?
No, no, I'm not.
You're not. All right. Are you against not doing homework? I've lost it, right? I don't know what I'm saying yes, right?
You're right.
Right. That would be an example of an unnecessary complex question, right? Don't make it one of those, you know, A minus B, B minus A. What does that mean? Don't make it one of those. Ordering of questions is a subtle one that politicians do a lot of, where you don't have one question, you have 3 questions. And the first 2 questions, you're not really interested in the answer. The first 2 questions are just to warm people up. And then the third question is the one that you want to influence them on. So you might start off by saying, let's think. X amount of people are in jail in Washington state. Do you think we should be spending another 100 million on building a new prison? People say yes or no to that. And then the next one is 60% of inmates in jail are actually in jail for minor offences, non-violent offences. Are you in favour of reducing the jail time for non-violent offences. And you haven't like that one. And then you've got them kind of warmed up to the idea that we spend too money in jail and maybe it would be a good idea if they're non-violent for them to get out. And so you then hit them with the third one, which is the one you're trying to influence them. And then you say to them, should there be a reduction in jail population? Now, you've already committed to saying, I don't want to spend too much money. You're probably already committed to, yeah, if people haven't done a violent, why have we got all these people in jail that really don't need to be there? So now aren't you kind of fixed into agreeing with them you should reduce the prison population? Yeah, see how we've influenced you? By the first two questions they didn't really care about. They were just to get you to say yes to the third one. There should be a reduction in, the prisoner population, which, if you know anything about some places in America, has ended up being a really bad idea, in my opinion. I'm probably wrong. We've talked about confidentially and anonymity, right? It's not a good idea to stop a person in the street and tell them, have you been unfaithful to your wife, right? You're probably not going to get an awful lot of honest answers, right? Or teenagers asking them about drug intake. Let me leave that one. And so I'm putting that in as a resource. So, there are some cool things, I think, cool things in there. I'm now going to go and look at the second one, which is kind of what today is mostly about. And we're going to look at sampling techniques, experiments, and all that fun stuff. Click on this one. And is that the one? I think I'm in the wrong one here. It's a PDF I'm looking for, not a video. I think it's this one. Let me check. Yes, it's this one. Okay. Maybe make it a little bit bigger. Oh, darn it. I've got a joke in my head. Sorry, I gotta get it out. You ready for a joke? Okay. Scotsman, American, and an Englishman died and go to heaven. And they've been shown around heaven, and the Scottish guy's dead excited because it's really a nice place and it's huge. And St. Peter was showing them around, and the Scotsman finally couldn't help himself. He says, look, heaven's great, he says, but it's really, really big. Do we get a car in heaven? And St. Peter says, yes, you get a car. And he goes, do we get any car we want? Because it's heaven, you should get anything you want. It says, no, it doesn't work that way. It depends on how good you were when you were on earth. And we just ask you one question, and depending on the answer, that's the kind of car you're going to get. So the Scotsman says, tell me, what's the question? I'm ready. And he says, how many times were you unfaithful to your wife? And he says, I was never unfaithful. And he looks at the book and he says, yep, you're right. And the Scots guy says, what kind of car do I get? And he turns around and boom, a big open topped sports car, top of the range. And the Scotsman dead excited, and he jumps in and he zooms off. And they look at the Englishman and the American, and he goes to the Englishman and says, okay, how many times were you unfaithful? And he said, just once, and she forgave me. That was it, just once. And he looks and says, you're right. And the Englishman says, well, what kind of car do I get? He says, well, you're not getting the same as him. We'll just give you a normal car. And boom, it appears, and he jumps in and drives away. And they go to the American, and he says, okay, how many times were you unfaithful? And he didn't want to answer. And St. Peter says, look, it's already written down. Just get it over with. How many? He said, 47 times. And St. Peter went, oh, you're right, 47. And he says, how? He said, I don't know how I got to heaven. I'm lucky, I guess. He says, well, what kind of car am I getting? And St. Peter says, well, you're getting nothing like the other two. And this guy's about 6'6", and a tiny little Mini appears with flat tires and the doors hanging off and cracked windscreen and rust everywhere. and he squeezes in and he drives away. And the next day they're at the traffic lights and the Scots guy pulls out in his big fancy Ferrari and Englishman on one side and the American on the other. And they both look inwards and they see the poor Scottish guy crying. And the American says to him, why are you crying? Look at the car I've got. And the Scotsman said, yeah, but I just saw my wife and she's using a skateboard.
Poor guy.
Is that it? No, by the way, it's a joke. No one was harmed in the making of that joke. I don't know if that helped. It helped me getting it out. It's probably not helped you because now you've got that joke in your head, but at least it's out of my head. So we are now going to look at how do we conduct data collection. And it boils down that there are two techniques for doing it, right? One is experimental and the other is called observation, right? So when you conduct a statistical study, here are the kind of questions that you might be interested in, and you can read through that in your own time. And so we are going to look at the two major ones, a controlled experiment and an observational study. Now, in a controlled experiment, you typically are in charge of everything. So what does that mean? It means that you, let's suppose I was interested in, does vitamin C tablets help you recover from the cold quicker than if you don't take them, right? In other words, is vitamin C good for colds, right? And what I would do in an experimental design, a controlled experiment, is I'd randomly get 500 people, old and young, healthy, couch potatoes, everything, right? And I'd randomly split them into two groups, say of 250 each. And one of those groups is told to take these pills when they get a cold, right? And the other one is told to take a different pill. What they don't know is that one group gets a vitamin C tablet, and when they get the cold, they're meant to say how many days your cold lasted for, right? I caught a cold and it lasted 4 days. I caught a cold and it lasts 2 days, right? They just record roughly how many days it lasted for. And then the second group, they got a pill, but that pill had no effective ingredients. It's called a sugar pill, right? It looked like a vitamin C, right? It's same color, same size, tastes the same. You try and make everything the same. And that guy, that unknown pill, right? That known pill, it's called a placebo, Placebo. Anybody heard of placebo? Right. Want to tell me where you've heard that term, or the context that you've heard about it?
I've heard it. I think I remember, might have probably earlier, but the first time I can remember having it explained was in a psychology class in high school. They talked about placebo effect and all that.
Yes. Now, they discovered, surprisingly enough, but it was discovered that if someone takes a pill and they think the pill is meant to do something, like make their cold get better or stop them having a headache and various things like that, that if they believed in it, it actually had a physical effect on them, right? It actually worked to a small degree. It wasn't, it was never going to cure cancer, right? You'll never get placebo effect. Here's this pill, it'll make your cancer go away, right? It doesn't do that, but it would work for headaches. Take this pill and your headache goes away, right? It's called the placebo effect. And so the reason you give the other group that pill is they think, or at least they don't know, that they're not getting a vitamin C, right? And so that destroys the placebo effect because everybody gets a pill and everybody thinks they're getting the pill that's meant to do something, right? So the placebo effect is balanced out in both groups, so it isn't an effect. If you didn't do that, if one group just got nothing and was told, when you catch a cold, just tell me how long it lasts, the placebo effect would have the ones that got the pill would have this extra benefit of thinking it was going to improve on them. And that's called the placebo effect. It's used, medicine has got a lot of examples of that actually working. I'll give you a very quick story for me. When I was young, thankfully not anymore, I used to get travel sick, right? Didn't like buses, especially that diesel, didn't like buses, didn't like anything that moved, right? I would get sick. And my mum told me that if I took my ear and I rubbed it, I wouldn't feel so sick. Now, when you're really young, your mum is gospel, right? If she tells you something, it's true. And so because I believed in it so strongly, when I was feeling car sick, a lot of the time I would just rub my ear and I wasn't physically sick, which was good for everyone. Now, rubbing your ear has absolutely nothing to do with being car sick, agreed? Physiologically, it doesn't do anything. That was an example of the placebo effect, where I thought it was going to do some good. And because of that, my brain was telling me, you're not as dizzy as you think you are, right? Because you're rubbing your ear and that dizziness is going away and you controlled it. So you all may have examples of that in your life, right? Where if you believe something, it actually had an effect. And that's the placebo effect. And so controlled experiments very often have a placebo in them to compensate for that. Now, back to my story about the vitamin C and the not vitamin C thing. They introduced a thing called blind and double blind. So let me talk a little bit about that as well. In fact, maybe I should write some of this down because it's not all in one place. So I'll come back to that later if we have time. Right. So to start my story, right, the vitamin C one. What do you, I think my wife pronounces vitamin differently. How do you pronounce vitamin?
Vitamin.
Yeah, you put more Vi sound on it. God, Americans are going to have to learn how to talk. Right. So you have 500 people in your big sample. And you break it down into two groups. And they don't need to be the same size, but they can be. And one group is called the control group. And the control group get the sugar pill. What's called the placebo. And the other group is called the experimental group. And they get the vitamin C, right? That's where we're kind of at the story right now. Now, you wait a certain amount of time, you're right, you wait till the winter's gone, right? Till the winter's over and the cold season's finished, and you collect data from both groups. And in this group, the mean number of days that they had the cold for was 3 days. And for this group over here, the mean number of days was 2.5, right? So if you're in the experimental group, you might not even have caught the cold, right? You might, but on average, when you did catch it, it was 2.5 days it lasted. And this group over here, it was 3 days. Can you see that there's some evidence, if this was true, that vitamin C does reduce how long you have the cold for, right? In fact, if you ever get the cold and you go to the, Safeway, and do some of you get those, I think it's zinc tablets and things, right? They do the same job, but isn't their job to try and reduce the time that you're ill, right? Some people take them before they get ill, hoping that it'll stop them catching the cold in the first place. And that is it. Now, introduce the word blind. A single blind experiment is when the control group don't know what pill they're getting, In this case, they don't know that that's a sugar pill, right? As far as they're concerned, it could be the vitamin C, right? You don't tell them. And they don't know either, right? So nobody knows what kind of pill you got. But they have a thing called a double blind. And a double blind experiment, again, they found out they needed to do this. The double blind experiment is when only you or the person who's running the experiment knows who got the vitamin C. Now, in this particular question, this would be a single blind experiment because people just report it to you. But in a lot of situations, what happens is if you're in a clinical trial, which is a name that they give for this procedure, right? So imagine there was going to be a clinical trial on this, and not on vitamin C, but let's say a clinical trial on migraine, right? They've got a new medication out here that is meant to reduce how many times you get the migraine and how long it lasts when you get it, right? There's actually medication out for that. So you would have 500 people who get migraine, randomly split them into two groups, right? So some of these people get migraine a lot and some like once a blue moon, but they get it, right? Same in this group. You give them the pill, one gets the real pill and the other doesn't get anything, right? They don't get any migraine medication. They just suffer, right? But you go to your doctor, these people, and your doctor will see you once a month because these things sometimes take a year or 2 years. And every month you go in and see your doctor, it's typically paid by the pharmaceutical company. And the doctor will say, how many times did you get migraine this month? And you would say, oh, twice. And how long did they last for? And they'd write that down. And the doctor collects the information and then sends it on to the pharmaceutical company, which would be me. Now, the patient doesn't know whether they're getting migraine or not, right? They just know they're getting a pill and it could be the migraine thing, it might not. So that takes care of the first level, that's a single blind. In a double blind, the doctor who's collecting the information from you doesn't know either. They don't know if you're getting the migraine tablet or not. And you might think, well, why should you even need to worry about that? They found out that if the doctor knows whether you're on the control group getting no medication or you're on the experimental group getting the medication, that he sometimes, it's not deliberate, but he indicates in other ways to that patient what's going on. I'll give you an example. Suppose I know that, I'll pick somebody. Suppose I know Alexis is not getting the migraine tablet, right? And you're coming in for your monthly visit. And I go, how are you getting on, Alexis? How's that migraine? And, you know, you okay? You feeling all right about it? You know, just that kind of extra sympathy thing that I'm doing really badly. Can't you pick up subconsciously that you're not getting the good pill? And that affects you. Or if you know you're getting it, you might be much more positive, you know. How's that migraine going? You know, is it doing okay? You know, is it getting better? You know, positive feedback, right? Negative feedback because you think you're not getting treated. They give you positive feedback because they think you are getting it. And those things interfere with the placebo effect again, right? The doctor's kind of worried about me. Well, my migraine's not working, right? I'll probably end up with more migraine now because you're stressing me out, right? And you can have that effect. So the best experiment in the world is a double blind. You don't know what's happening to you. The person, the doctor typically who's collecting the information doesn't know what you're getting. So when that's combined then, isn't the only difference that is accounted for, the only reason for that difference, isn't it that the medicine must be doing something good in this case? Now, there are many, many situations where you cannot do controlled experiments. Unethical is the most common reason. So, suppose I was interested in smoking and its effect on, let's not do smoking, marijuana smoking, and its effect on your mental health. So we're conducting, and I hope to goodness that the government is doing this, and if they're not, they're highly irresponsible. They should be conducting clinical experiments right now, because there's legalized marijuana smoking, right? People do it for entertainment, for want of a better word, right? Recreational drug use. So they should be collecting like 500 volunteers, and 250 of them, well, let's redo that. You collect 500 people, 250 smoke marijuana regularly, and the other 250 don't. So right away, those two groups are different, right? You can't do an experiment on that. To do an experiment, wouldn't I have to get 500 people, randomly put them into two groups, and say to the first group, you must smoke marijuana for the next year. Whether you want to or not, that's your job. And say the other 250, you are not allowed to smoke marijuana, right? If we, you know, there's financial benefits, right? If you don't smoke marijuana, we'll keep an eye on you, you know, blood tests and things to make sure, right? We'll give you 10,000 at the end of this, you know, blah, blah, right? Can you see in this case, you know exactly what your treatment is. My treatment is smoking marijuana. My treatment is not. The doctor who's going to check you, in this case, we're interested in all sorts of things. I would suggest that the government should look into things like basic health. What's their weight like, right? Is it any different in the two groups? The marijuana smokers, are they thinner, which is not a bad thing, right? Are they fatter, right? Are they about the same? Mental health. There is some evidence that marijuana smokers can suffer schizophrenia to a higher extent, and also paranoia. Not just you know, paranoia like everybody has paranoia, but like paranoia all the time, right? Like their life is dysfunctional, right? Everybody's out to get me kind of person, right? And mental health issues, and they should, you know, record the incidences of both. And at the end of a certain amount of time, and sometimes it might take 5 years to get good data, because you know the effect of things that are bad don't always happen in the first day, right? Don't they take like 3, 4, 5 years to have a cumulative effect? And let's say at the end of 5 years, twice as many people who smoke marijuana have reported schizophrenia or paranoia compared to this group. Wouldn't that be a health danger? That smoking marijuana is bad for your mental health. Now, if after 5 years it comes back that there's no difference, the same number of people in both groups are the same, hey, marijuana doesn't do anything really that bad to you, right? And that's good as well. All you need is the truth, right? You can't ask marijuana smokers, is it good for you? Would you agree the answer you get would be bias? No, it's horrible for me, but I still smoke it. It's probably not an answer you get much, right? Are we good? Right. So that is what a controlled experiment looks like, and there's more detail in that notes. I'm not going to use those notes. You can read them. We're going to look at now a different kind of study. And the second one is an observational study. Now, in an observational study, you have no control over what the people in your sample do. So you might get a random sample, say 250 people. And once you've got that random sample, you find out that 100 of them, right, don't exercise much or none. And the other 150 do, right? And we are interested here then in an observational study of comparing people who don't do exercise with people who do. And you might find that there are some differences. And let's suppose one of those differences is the number of hours of TV that they watch. And let's just say, for argument, that in a typical day, the people who don't do exercise watch TV for 3 hours, and the people who do exercise only watch it for 2 hours. And so you might think, hey, what's the connection? Well, you could make the connection all sorts of ways. People who watch TV a lot don't exercise. People who don't watch TV a lot do exercise. So if you were a totalitarian country, wouldn't you restrict your TV to only being on 2 hours a day? That'll make the country healthy, won't it? Probably not. Would you agree that people who don't exercise probably don't do a whole lot of other things and do a whole lot of other things, right? So maybe they don't exercise, but probably they eat too much. Probably they don't read a lot, right? Probably they do this, probably they don't that. Couldn't there be 101 things, and TV watching isn't the major issue in their life? The watching of the TV is not what's stopping them from doing exercise. Couldn't it be I'm just born lazy and I don't want to exercise? Couldn't it be I eat so much I'm dead fat and exercising's not my thing? Because when you're big and fat, you don't want to exercise. At least in my case, I don't want to, right? So you can't tell what the cause of doing and not doing exercise based on any variable that you might detect in their lifestyle. Couldn't there be all sorts of other lifestyles? One of the reasons why smoking and cancer were so difficult to prove the direct link is because we could only do observational studies. We knew people who didn't smoke, how long they lived, and how many of them died of lung cancer. And we had another group of people who we did know that smoked, how long they lived, and how many of them, what percentage of them died of lung cancer. And it's quite different, you know, as you'd imagine, the two groups, right? The ones that didn't smoke tend to live longer and didn't get lung cancer anywhere near as often as the other group. And you might think, well, we've nailed it. Smoking gives you lung cancer, right? But because it was an observational study, you had no control of how these people did what they chose to do. They argued quite successfully, most of the cigarette companies did, that that isn't evidence. And you would say, well, why not? Well, we agree that people who smoke a lot do get lung cancer more often than people who don't, right? Because the numbers tell me that. But people who smoke a lot also do all sorts of other things different from the other group. They drink more. They exercise less. They eat more. They do A, B, C, D, and E more. Why isn't it any one of those things that's causing the lung cancer? And isn't smoking just a reflection of it? Right? How could you prove it? Well, if you were in a fascist state, wouldn't you get 250 people, split them into two groups, and say to group one, do everything that you've done in your life the same, but you've now to smoke 100 cigarettes a day, and if you don't, we'll shoot you. And you go to the other lot and you say, I want you to do everything else that you've been doing in your life, right? So if you never exercise, still don't exercise, right? If you eat too much, still keep eating too much, but you can't smoke. If you smoke, we'll shoot you, right? Whatever it is, you know, we'll put you in jail, right? Totalitarian countries. Can you imagine a country where we did that? At the end of that time period, wouldn't the only difference between the two groups be the smoking? Because in each group, there were fat people and skinny people, and people who exercised and people who didn't, right? All the other variables that could be the cause came out. And that was not allowed, right? Ethically, you're not allowed to make people do bad things to themselves just to prove that that's a bad thing to do yourself, right? You're just not allowed to do that. Even you're not allowed to get volunteers and say, would you like to volunteer to smoke 100 cigarettes a day for the next 5 years? You know, that's unethical, isn't it? Aren't you encouraging people to do something that's dangerous, right? So you can only observational, and it's so hard to get good evidence because of it. It's much better an experiment, isn't it? The two groups are pretty much the same, and only one thing's different about them, so you can come up with a decent proof. No way of doing this the same way. Any questions so far? Well, guess what? We have made it to 11:50. So this is a natural point for us to finish.